Hello everybody, my name is David Cross. I'm an artist and a reader in art and design, and I'd like to welcome you to Chelsea College of Arts for the first Professorial platform of 2009. It's a very appropriate setting. 2009.
Into the future. Academic year 2009. 9 to 10.
Exactly, thank you for that. It's a very appropriate venue, in fact. I'm just looking at the inscriptions on the back there saying Royal Army Medical College, where people will be learning about the anatomy and all sorts of techniques of how to deal with it. But my job is to tell you a little bit about Oriana and to introduce her talk this evening, and then afterwards to direct you to the reception which is taking place in the Red Room. Oriana Baddeley is Professor of Art History and Director of Research for Camberwell, Chelsea and Wimbledon Colleges of Art. She's also Deputy Director for the University of the Arts London's Research Centre, TRAIN, which is the acronym for Transnational Arts, Identity and Nation. Oriana studied history and theory of art at the University of Essex under the supervision of the internationally renowned surrealist expert Dawn Adis. While teaching part-time at Camberwell College of Art, Oriana's doctoral subject, charting the development of ideas of art and barbarism in ancient Mexican historiography, formed the basis for work on the 1992 Hayward exhibition, The Art of Ancient Mexico. In the 1990s, with Toshio Watanabe and Paul Greenhalgh, she began working on one of the then London Institute's first research projects, British Empire and Design, which led to the setting up of collaborative research activities across Camberwell and Chelsea colleges. This work led Oriana and Toshio to collaborate with the noted scholar Partha Mitta on a major 3-year Arts and Humanities Research Board funded project, Nation, Identity and Modernity, Visual Culture of India, Japan and Mexico between 1860 and 1940. From this project, she went on to found with Toshio Watanabe the University of the Arts London Research Centre Transnational Arts, Identity and Nation, which is now co-run with Professor Deborah Cherry of Central St Martin's. Oriana has written extensively on contemporary Latin American art, notably including Drawing the Line, Art and Cultural Identity in Contemporary Latin America, co-authored with Valerie Fraser and published by Verso in 1989. And this has become a standard work on the subject. Oriana has also collaborated with the Institute of International Visual Arts and Gerardo Mosquera to produce the widely read Beyond the Fantastic, Art Criticism from Contemporary Latin America, published by Ineva and MIT in 1996. Other notable publications include an essay on contemporary responses to Frida Kahlo, and that's in the catalogue to the Tate Modern exhibition, for which Oriana also organised an international conference titled The Many Faces of Frida at Tate Modern in 2005. From 2006 to 7, she was part of the TRAIN Federal University of Rio de Janeiro project, titled Transnational Correspondence, writing on the relocation of authenticity and transnational dilemmas for the final conference at Tate Modern, and for the project publication in Brazil by Arte de Ensaios. Oriana is on the International Advisory Committee of the University of Essex Collection of Latin American Art. She's on the editorial board of Art History and a trustee of the St. Catherine Foundation. This evening, Oriana will present her thoughts on Teresa Margolles, an artist whose practice focuses on the body and moves between beauty and horror to connect social and economic injustice with the great questions of human existence. So it's my very great pleasure then to introduce the professorial platform this evening, Teresa Margolles and the Pathology of Everyday Death by Oriana Baddeley.
Welcome, and thank you very much, David, for that kind introduction. Thank you all for coming here tonight, and I hope that the subject matter that we're going to discuss fits with the general sense you have of this particular week of the year, that period between Halloween, the Day of the Dead, and the general sort of rupture of time that's usually celebrated at this moment when the spirits escape out into the spirits of the dead escape out into the world of the living. I want to talk tonight about the work of the artist Teresa Margolles and look at her work within the context of ideas of cultural stereotype and the burden of expectation of national identities that we often place upon artworks. Margolles' most recent work, What Else Could We Talk About?, which was curated by the art critic Cuauhtémoc Medina, formerly a curator at the Tate, formed the Mexican pavilion in the Palazzo Rota Ivancic in the 2009 Venice Biennale. It's a picture of Margolles used in the catalogue for Venice. It's interesting that this is only the second time that Mexico has had a pavilion at Venice, at what is the sort of spiritual home of the national in art. Through the vagaries of history, Mexico had previously not engaged directly with the issues of national representation, which for many artists and critics and historians over the last century have been the key issue that they've had to address in confronting the exhibitions at Venice. How in a time of global culture do the particularities of the past and the specifics of geography relate to the production of contemporary art? And I think this is probably one of the key questions I want to kind of skirt around. I'm not a terribly direct speaker, and I'm going to try and suggest various things. So you can always come back at me at the end if you want me to draw out slightly more pointed answers to any of these questions. In what sense do the traditions of interpretation and historical expectations of meaning impose themselves on the work of the transnational artist and the transnational audience? This, by the way, is a photograph of the exterior of the Palazzo, and the piece by Margolles that you probably don't even know you're looking at is what was in fact a blood-stained piece of cloth, which is hung like a flag on the exterior of the building alongside the Venice flag and the EU flag. So the cloth billowing in the center there, which blends so beautifully into the terracotta of the building, is indication of some of the subject matter that Margolles is dealing with inside the Palazzo. Many countries have been defined by stereotypes of cultural production, often of a limited historical meaning, but very tenacious shelf life. There's endless red buses in front of Big Ben, or in terms of what we're looking at today, there could never be any other interpretation of that little pile of objects there than they related in some way to vague ideas we might have about Mexicanness. Few, I think, countries have been more prone to this sense of shorthanding of cultural reference in terms of what their stereotype of national identity might be. The visual culture of Mexico has been laden with the weight of representational meaning since the first contact of Europe and the Americas in the 15th century. The flora and fauna of Mexico have been explained and described, its inhabitants recognizably characterized for both internal and external audiences. the endless Mexican sleeping under his sarape and his hat to be kicked by some passing Clint Eastwood type in any Western. The definitions of Mexicanness have also, and of this natural culture, have ranged from simplistic stereotypes to complex attempts at reconciling the political tensions of a racially divided post-colonial society. Images such as this one by the popular artist, the Linares family, of a famous character from the 19th century printmakers of José Guadalupe Posada. This character, La Catrina, is a recognized representation of the inheritance of colonialism within Mexico, and was taken up very much in the post-Mexican revolutionary period in the early 20th century as an image of the colonial moment. But as I say, definitions of national culture range from simplistic stereotypes to complex attempts to reconcile the political tensions and of a racially divided post-colonial society. For many artists, Mexican identity has become a commodity to be packaged, sold, and resold. Containment of its meaning has applied a patent copyright that allows for the themed fast food restaurant or the decoration of European suburban homes in a recognizably Mexican style. I don't know how many times you've ever watched a sort of changing room program where they say, and this is a Mexican room, or this is a Mexican color, or a set of Mexican objects suddenly, turn this place, probably in the backwaters of a British suburb, into something Mexican themed. And this Mexican style is something that you can purchase at home base. You can find at the end of an internet browser button. Part of this, a long-standing theme of what I would call this commodified Mexico, has been the association of death with this phenomenon of Mexicanness. From the fascination with Aztec deities, and if you look at the current viewing figures for the Moctezuma show at the British Museum and the enormous audiences they had for their Day of the Dead activities this weekend, you'll see that it's an incredibly popular activity, considering it deals with something that mostly people try to put into the bottom drawer and forget about. So one moves from the fascination with Aztec deities through to the popularity of the Day of the Dead phenomenon. And for many audiences and curators alike, death remains a key word in the evocation of Mexican culture. As the surrealist poet André Breton described it in a special edition of the magazine, the surrealist magazine Minotaur, which he had devoted to his trip to Mexico. Mexico, he states, was that terre rouge, terre vierge, red earth, virgin earth, generously impregnated with blood, the earth where the life of man is worthless or priceless, depending on how you want to interpret that particular one. But this image of Mexico is one I want to come back to later on. It was it's probably the most famous photograph by Manuel Alvarez Bravo, the Mexican photographer. It was actually taken in 1934, but it was reprinted and given very wide currency by André Breton as the front cover for his evocation of the Mexico of surrealist fantasy. And this place, this Mexico, the virgin earth impregnated generously with blood, is the place metaphorically forever south of a border, the place of danger, the place of difference, the place of the unknown. It's a place where life and death exist in stark opposition, and where death is always lurking in the shadows. A fascination with death and with the forensics of death is not in itself an unusual focus in terms of the interest that artists and curators have recently manifested. But the work of Teresa Margolles, the artist I want to look at tonight, has attracted attention of an increasingly large audience. This piece, Catafalco, just so you get a sense, I think, of how it's made, this is just a detail of part of an imprint she's made of a body in the morgue in Mexico City. And the fluids that have been used to wash the dead body are still clinging to the interior of the cast. So it has this very strange reference to existence and non-existence. So almost as though the process of cleaning the body has taken something from the life force of the individual from which this cast is made, and what you have left is the imprint with the traces of a former existence. Her reputation's been growing since the 1990s, based on her work as a founder member of the Mexico City-based collective Semaphore, an acronym derived from the Servicio Médico Forense, the forensic medical service. In recent years, Margolles' reputation has become established outside of Mexico and expanded from dedicated followers of her work to encompass a more general critical interest. With her intervention at Venice receiving wide-scale critical acclaim, I think as you read through reports of critics visiting the Biennale in 2009, you'll start to, if you hadn't picked it up before, one of the things you notice is that all of them seem to have been incredibly moved and affected by the Mexican pavilion. This is one of the rooms of the pavilion where the mechanism I referred to before in terms of the flag hanging outside the palazzo is used in the interior of the space to create these tapestries, the tapestries of blood. Again, the fabric is dipped in blood of victims of the Mexican drug wars on the border. I'll come back to that and to this work slightly later on. While deeply political, the themes of Margolles' art grow out of her fascination with what she calls the life of corpses and the ways that even in death, social hierarchies and injustices remain. The materials that she uses in her art break taboos of realism, even in those reality-addicted societies that we now inhabit. The reuse in her art of human remains, body parts, and fluids contaminated with the real processes of the afterlife repel and frighten many, but nonetheless forge her audiences to encounter those aspects of the passage of death that are usually hidden from conscious thought. This is part of a film installation piece by Margolles called The Mexico City's Water, where she, again, is referring to the process of the washing of the bodies of the dead in the morgue. On one level, it's possible to link the interest in work such as that of Margolles to our desire to find within an increasingly virtual world, a virtual world that surrounds us with pretense, some form of absolute reality. At a time when everything appears reproducible and ultimately deceptive, truth can at least be found in the certainty of death. Sorry, that's not a very upbeat. But, I mean, it's true. We often appear, as a culture, to require proof that even while sort of metaphorically poking our fingers into the wounds, we have this sort of collective fascination with the bodies of the dead. In a sense, I think you can see Rembrandt's anatomy is being given new life at the moment by our fascination with things such as CSI Miami. I prefer Las Vegas, but I couldn't grab a screenshot of Las Vegas. From television and popular novels to blockbuster spectacles, such as Gunther von Hagen's Body Worlds, the forensics of death have held a sway over enormous audiences, and the audiences for things like Body Worlds are really amazing and hark back, I think, to a different sense of exhibition attendance, rather like those of the great exhibitions of the 19th century. Within this context, Margolles' growing reputation could be seen to reflect a wider cultural trend. But I think her work forces us to confront a world we would usually ask art to help us to forget. At the same time, such difficult material as that used by Margolles can often overpower the intentions of the artist and impose a sort of formal predictability. But I think I would argue that that is a danger that Margolles' work skillfully avoids. The 2004 solo show, Muerte sin fin, Death Without End, at the Museum für Moderne Kunst in Frankfurt, helped establish Margolles as a major player on the international art scene. And her more recent work, such as that in Venice, this is a segment of it, Narco Messages, have really moved her from someone of maybe more specialist interest to a major player in the contemporary art world. In both locations, both in Frankfurt, in the solo show in Frankfurt and in Venice, her work explores the relationship of the artwork to the audience, blurring the distance between spectatorship and complicity. In the earlier works in Frankfurt, she used the transmutability of materials to break from the confines of the art object. The exhibition was framed by two related works, Air and Tears. In both, water used to wash the bodies of the dead in the morgue of Mexico City, was transformed first into bubbles and then into humidified air. Despite the sanitation of the water, the idea of its derivation is enough to create an emotionally charged sense of interwoven responses: fear, disgust, sadness, anger. The gallery audience has been contaminated by a work with or without its permission. You enter the gallery thinking, oh, how beautiful, a room full of bubbles. You walk among feeling like a child, and like a very traditional reference to the sort of memento mori image of the bubble blower. You only, as you've walked through the room, discover what it is you've been made complicit within. And again, in Tears, the humidified water in the atmosphere just drips onto the floor, and this is a device that one also finds implicit in some of the work in Venice that I'll come to in a moment. The very idea of breaking the taboo of distance surrounding the afterlife of the body is powerful enough to cause audiences to recoil, despite the irrationality of such a response. And I think that water and death remain in a complex opposition of meaning and are both very important within the work of Margolles. It is, of course, not possible to discuss Margolles' work as an artist without recognizing that it is interwoven with her training as a forensic technician and her role as such within the morgue in Mexico City. It is an aspect of her biography that appears to have both fascinated the art world and tied her work into the aforementioned widespread obsession with the materiality of death. It's this biographical detail that somehow imparts the works with credibility. Their contamination is made believable by the artist's own experiences. However, an interesting question that I can't help but ask myself in relation to Margolles is how important in that fascination is the juxtaposition of geography and of the theme, of death and of Mexico. Is the combination of gender, geographical location, and iconographic tradition of relevance in understanding responses to her work? would any morgue do? Would any morgue technician do? Or does that of Mexico City and our expectations of Mexicanness and death carry its own dimension of meaning? For an artist whose work frequently challenges and surprises, it may seem contradictory for an analysis to arise via a discussion of cultural cliché, but I believe it's through a recognition of the wider context of cultural stereotyping that the real power of Margolles' work can be appreciated. In many ways, the association of art and death is so accepted, a kind of a signifier of Mexicanness, it has become, for international audiences, one of the demanded characteristics of what can be perceived as an authentic cultural expression, with this very particular, geographically determined meaning. It can be seen in the popularity of José Guadalupe Posada's skeletal caricatures, which we see endlessly repeated on T-shirts, accessories, carrier bags, handbags. We look at this kind of imagery, we look at the reference to the primitive sort of woodcut feel of Posada, which was also something, is a rather artificial construct. And we immediately associate it with a certain sense of irreverence, at laughing in the face of danger, but definitely of Mexicanness. We see it also in the simple things like the visions of barbarism, which underpin films such as Mel Gibson's Apocalypto, where we kind of see this Mexico, this fantasy place, as a place somewhere like our other images of the barbaric that maybe exist in science fiction films, that are these places where life and death, you move very suddenly between life, death, and horror. In fact, the obsession with the physicality of death in Mexico is frequently constructed as synonymous. Descending, I think, to some extent from the propagandist polemics of the Spanish conquest, the Europeans, when they arrived, just did everything they could to talk about how barbaric the people were that they were conquering. And I think some of that still underlines parts of the Moctezuma show. This expectation of Mexico and barbarism was given new impetus by the complex debates of post-revolutionary Mexico, within which the role of death and its imagery became a constituent part of constructions of Mexicanness, with that image of the death figure, particularly of the female death figure, being somehow or other an elision of the pre-Hispanic and the colonial. This cultural space is no world of the spiritual afterlife, but it is the purgatory of the decomposing body, the horrid fascination of the defiled corpse, the skeletal remainder of the transitory nature of life. It's a Mexico described by colonizing Spaniards and made the stuff of European fantasies of otherness. It is the Mexico loved by surrealists such as Breton, that which he described and evoked in his Souvenir du Mexique that I showed a bit earlier on, which he produced after his visit to Mexico in 1938, where he stayed with Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, and where he co-wrote with Rivera and Leon Trotsky his famous text on art and revolution. It's also the Mexico that beckoned and became the obvious second home of the artist Damien Hirst. No one, I think, was surprised when Hirst revealed that he was spending some time in Mexico and having a house in Mexico, exhibiting at some Mexican galleries, because it resonated with that ability we saw in Hirst to trespass on the territory of the embalmer. It's the Mexico of accepted cultural stereotypes. And it's that, on that kind of superficial reading, I think, that Margolles' art can be seen as fitting perfectly into that world, that fantasy of what Mexico is, or in fact conforming to that world. Margolles' first big impact was arguably through her involvement with an early collective work produced by Semaphore at the Museo Carrió-Gil called Lavatio Corporis of 1994. The installed works shocked visitors with the use of dead animals and the odours of decay appearing to cross the line between art and reality in the stark evocation of pain, cruelty, and suffering. Appearing as it did relatively soon after the exhibition of Damien Hirst's Mother and Child Divided, the Mexico City exhibition was seen by some critics as a manifestation of the same tendencies in contemporary art. In discussing the Semaphore piece, though, the critic Coco Fusco makes a key point on the distinction between the work of Hirst and the underlying aesthetic of Semaphore, and by extension, I think, Margolles. As Fusco states, whereas Hirst's composition evokes the hyper-rationalist work of the laboratory, Semaphore's theatre of death invokes Catholicism's embrace of suffering as the performative imitation of Christ. Fusco describes and analyzes the works in detail, drawing out post-colonial themes which underpin the more sensational aspects of the play on the spirit of the abattoir. In this set of works, the relationship with metaphors of Mexicanness were very self-consciously explored through the aesthetic, and to some extent even more literal, dissection of the thematic elements of the work of a very iconically Mexican artist, José Clemente Orozco. Orozco's work, which some major pieces of which form the basis of the collection within the Museo Carrió-Gil, were taken as the starting point by this group of young artists. And a work by Orozco was used to contextualize the thematics of the installation and the point, and made to point to the unpicking of national myth that formed the primary focus of the overall exhibition. The bodies of dead horses, symbolically imprisoned and tortured within the exhibition, drew on the illusion of meaning in Mexico between the Spanish conquerors and the alien creatures that they brought with them and that literally brought them. The expectation of the barbaric, the terrifying, and the dangerous all evoked the expected characteristics of Mexican art, but by taking them to the extreme, they made a sort of forced recognition of the limitations of the cultural space of such a stereotype. The performative and the ritualistic, noted by Fusco, remained an important element of Margolles' work. In Burial of 1999, produced while still part of Semaphore, but exhibited in Cuauhtémoc Medina's first exhibition of Margolles' work, 20 Million Mexicans Can't Be Wrong, at the South London Gallery. I think we see an interesting example of this combination of the performative and the ritualistic. Unlike the drama of Lavatio Corporis, this work used the language of minimalism, and most people, I think, coming into the gallery would have tripped over this or not noticed it or paid, not known, have the builders left something behind, etc. It's a very, very minimalist statement just lying on the gallery floor. The work used this language of minimalism to present its audience with a seemingly banal concrete oblong, resting like an abandoned piece of building material on the floor of the gallery. It's hard, really, to attend to its everydayness, and yet its meaning, once grasped, becomes impossible to ignore. The concrete block encases forever a stillborn fetus. At least that's what we're told. It's interesting, and it's something that I often think about Margolles' work, that it depends very much on trust and narrative power, on our belief in her account of the derivation of her works. We readily accept them and are horrified, disgusted, and affected by what we are told is in those bubbles, is in the humidified water, is in the concrete block. In this simple and unadorned manner, the gallery is transformed into a mausoleum. the sculpture into a sepulchre. In the curation of the exhibition, Medina attempted to confront the notion of an authentic national culture, exploring instead the specificity of the context of Mexico City as a transnational location, and looking at the ways in which relocating the artwork then transforms its meaning. However, while the formal language of the concrete block denied the expectation of authentic Mexican, to some extent the theme of death was so powerfully expected in relation to Mexico that the work, I think, had far more impact because it was somehow or other expected that the theme of death would still be there. The enduring hold of such imagery on expectations of authentic Mexicanness can be seen as both a constriction on creative engagement with such themes, or, as I would argue in the case of Margolles, as a fertile ground for the inversion of expectations. As a Mexican artist, the international expectations of conformity to an authentic identity has to be confronted or at least recognized if one wishes to escape ghettoization. As a tactic, however, a denial of cultural authenticity soon itself becomes restrictive. It's a sort of lose-lose situation. It's very difficult for artists who gain critical attention through the expectations of cultural stereotype to then completely undermine those expectations. But I think in this and in subsequent work, Margolles has played on such expectations with subtlety and great skill. In a combination of Catholic imagery and political revelation, Margolles exhibited in 2000 the embalmed, this is the one where everyone goes, oh no, you know, it's been easy to look at till now, but this is a bit harder to take, I think. Margolles exhibited the embalmed, pierced tongue of a dead drug addict. This work, Tongue, explored, as Cuauhtémoc Medina has put, that despite popular wisdom, death is not egalitarian. Social taxonomies are reinscribed not only in the causes of death, but also in the fate of our remains. The work has both a horror and immediacy that easily distinguishes it from the more measured physicality of Brit art, from the blood head, from the mother and child divided, etc. The embalmed tongue, brought from the family of the victim, is part of the overall work. Sorry, it's but part of the overall work, which actually gains its meaning from the process of its making and its exhibiting. The fact that the family were willing, in fact keen, to sell the tongue in order to pay for the burial of the victim. And they were willing to agree to the creation of the work in exchange for the cost of the dead man's burial. And I think in that sense, the whole process carries with it an implicit social critique. The work is critiquing itself as it's actually being produced. Again, its exhibition in Los Angeles is a poignant reminder of the impossibility of its live owner to escape the circumstances of his own poverty. The dead tongue can cross the border, can speak in the context of the Los Angeles Gallery in a way that the individual caught up in that violence of the drug world could not. Margolles' tongue is there to speak for the silent, to impact in death as it could not in life, a fragment of the everyday reality of death statistics on the streets of any big city, forcing its way into the safe spaces of the gallery. The iconography of death in Mexico come with different sets of associated characteristics. It can be the mocking calavera or the threatening Aztec goddess, melancholic or reassuringly life-affirming, but it's most commonly feminized. And in this sense, I think Margolles' interaction with the bodies of the dead as a mourner, as an active participant, as an inheritor of collective trauma, inverts the traditional iconography of Mexico, death, femininity, and otherness. In that sense, Margolles, as the female artist, is not the feminine other. She is the person presenting the dialogue around that construction of otherness. Her active intervention and her incorporation of the audience into her actions forces us to remember what it is we want to forget. This is, I think, incredibly eloquently done in her work produced on the theme of the murders of the women in Ciudad Juarez. In this work, Margolles explores the ignoring of the so-called maquiladora murders, named after the factories that have sprung up along the Mexico-North American border since 1992, when the Free Trade Agreement was signed. Since 1993, 400 girls and women have been murdered in Ciudad Juarez, and a further 100 have disappeared without a trace. The mysterious circumstances under which these murders have been committed has given rise to many speculations, but they are as yet unsolved. Many of the hundreds of young women killed worked in the factories for companies who switched production south of the border to benefit from the lower costs. Again, as with tongue, the victims are the poor and the unrepresented. In this instance, the sheer enormity of the tragedy is difficult for the artist to engage with. Margolles somehow manages, through her video sound piece, I'll come back to this one in a minute, Lote Bravo, Lomas de Poleo, Anapra y Cerro de Cristo Negro, which combines a seemingly endless car journey, this is the film piece, around the sites of the murders, just with the soundtrack of the sounds of the desert night. The scale and loneliness of the piece is reinforced by the sculptural installation of handmade bricks. The sand for the bricks has been collected by the artist at points within Ciudad Juarez where the bodies of victims have been found. As with Burial and the earlier water pieces, the sense of deathly contamination imparts a poignancy and an evocative power to seemingly abstract forms. In this work, it's even more evident that Margolles' work is not aimed at a sensationalizing of death, but rather a politicizing of attitudes towards the repressed horrors of the everyday. The collection of the physical evidence of Mexico's politics of death is also the key element of what else could we talk about, the piece in Venice. The work takes as its subject what the catalogue calls Mexico's elephant in the room, the drug wars, mostly based around the border towns of North Mexico, that have in the last year claimed more than 5,000 lives. That's more than the American forces killed in the Iraq War. That's more than the dead of many of the most recent moments of terrible horror and of war, but not something that we think about all the time. As Medina points out in his essay, which accompanies the installation, more bullets were fired in 2008 than in any year of the country's recent history. And I suppose those of you who know anything about Mexico know that that's quite a lot of bullets. Margolles has taken over the decaying Venice palazzo and has intricately woven her process of working into the literal fabric of the location. This is the upper floor of the installation. The palace's decaying walls, the silk as it is cut through just by chance and accident sort of echoes those rooms of blooded cloths that hang at various intervals within the installation. The cloths soaked in blood, collected at the sites of distant violence, hang on the walls, blending with the faded opulence of the silk coverings, silent and powerful reminders of worlds outside the boundaries of the art fair. On the ground floor, of what is an otherwise empty and dark space, there is an enormous mural of mud. Sorry, this is part of a close-up of the blooded cloths. This mural of mud has material dug from the sites of the discovery of murder victims. The mud clings to the fabric and it's never allowed to dry. It's there clinging to the cloth, kept moist by a constant spraying of water from behind the cloth. The water that's sprayed from behind the cloth drips a liquid contaminated with the mud, contaminated with the presence of the dead, slowly into the gully below. Liquid that then, with every passing day of the Biennale, is used to impregnate the floors of the palazzo with the remains of this distant violence. Each day, the cleaner's mops coat layers of meaning to this complex and literally multi-layered work. The installation is, in fact, the mopping of the floors with the water contaminated with the death of the victims of the drug wars in the north of Mexico. In what else could we talk about? As with the earlier Lotte Bravo, the social injustices that had been evoked by Manuel Alvarez Bravo's striking worker assassinated of 1934 that I started the lecture with are given physical form. This is an earth of Mexico impregnated with a more literal and politicized blood than that evoked by the Breton quote earlier, but possibly closer in spirit to the original context of the Alvarez Bravo photograph. Breton, on reprinting the work on the pages of his Souvenir du Mexique, chose to disconnect the photograph from its social context, to create an icon of otherness, using the image to note a place of both unconscious terror and desire. His Mexico was a place removed from the repercussions of the violence he reified. That of Margolles is a place where the everyday violence of the forgotten is forced upon our unwilling attention. I'm going to try. Oops, failed. As the artist and sometime collaborator of Margolles, Santiago Sierra, has stated, Margolles' work puts the assassins on constant trial by placing the corpses of those victims on society's table. It opposes the general indifference towards crimes always committed on another's skin, in another society, on the other side of the Atlantic, or on global television. It's a constant reminder of the fact that this Mexican who got killed could be any one of us. Thank you. I should have had that one of those sort of 9 o'clock watershed warnings before you sat down. I hope you're all still okay and can cope with the rest of the evening. If there are any questions, I'm happy to respond. Yeah.
How do you think that affects the way that we read the work? Because we have a thirst for broad, don't we? Do you think that changes?
I think that's why I'm impressed with how she's approached these issues in this very subtle way, in that you could actually almost not notice what it was you were looking at, but that once the idea is planted in your head, I mean, when I was there and you walk across the floors and you notice they're a little bit damp, and then you see someone's in the room and they're washing the floors, and then you gradually discover what it is you're implicit in. And all the next of the day, when I was in the Arsenale and they'd been washing the floors, you completely freaked out. You see a wet floor and you can't walk on it because you suddenly get this sense of involvement and complicity. And I think it's that way in which she actually forces you to recognize the things you're trying not to think about, but without showing you this horrendous sort of picture that makes it work, because it just sort of changes your way of thinking about what it is you're involved in. David.
I'll just ask a question that perhaps follows on from that. I didn't get to hear all of your lecture, but I did catch enough to hear about your take on the engagement in relationship political. And very much that sense of moving from the sensory engagement that you just outlined, to that moment of politicization, if you like, which very much resonates with my concerns about spectatorship. So I just wonder if you could say a little bit, perhaps in relation to your experience of the work, your thinking, your thoughts on the work, about that move from the sensory to the political in the mode, in the body.
I actually think that's very very apt, David, because it strikes me, and it's maybe something that I want to go on to do more about, but the difference between the death as spectacle and death as experience, because obviously death is always spectacle, because once we've experienced it, we can't talk about it any longer. So it's that sense in which we veer between trying to get as close as we can to experience, but it always remains the spectacle, you know. And so there's something there, which is a bit what I was getting about the sort of metaphorically, like St. Thomas poking the fingers into the wound. We want to experience something, find out more, but we don't really at the same time. So I think that line between spectatorship and experience is a really interesting one in relation to the theme of death. But I don't know where to go with that. But I think somewhere along the line, if we really did understand those experiences, we would be working in we would be working with far more political understanding of violence. Because I think it's because we don't want to experience it. We want it to be a spectacle. We can cope with the realities of the thousands and millions of deaths that we encounter through violence.
Oriana, do you think you have to break that down into the we? I mean, some of us in this room may have had very different experiences, but many of us may not have lived in a society where by violence, not by natural causes, people are dying that we know personally well all the time. So when we read about a bomb blowing up in Iraq or something, we don't, it's a third-hand experience.
I mean, I you know, mea culpa. We should always be examined, and obviously I think that's why I think Margolles' work is really interesting. I mean, she was born in the north of Mexico. She comes from the area where a lot of this violence is going on, and for her, it's a very real thing. And the catalogue, it's interesting. It has a series of essays from people who actually live in and around the worst hotspots and it talks about one of the writers in there, it's an essay. A poetic essay. It's about how you get to his little daughter. There's gunshots and they're all hiding under the bed, and the little daughter said, "Don't worry, that's at least 4 blocks away." And he was talking about how this is what we're giving our children, the ability to tell the distance of gunshots from the home and stuff like that. So that sense about who the we is obviously it's vital. But I think even if you're involved in the everyday of violence, I think there is still another issue about how you perceive death, whoever you are. You know, I think there is always a general sort of human unwillingness to view death as experience rather than spectacle. So. If this, I mean, yeah.
I just wanted to know if you could say a little bit about the relationship of the pathology of everyday death to the practice of everyday life, whether there is an association there. And the idea of resistance was something I was exploring. For me, the metaphysical questions, I can't reach those until I've been through some sense of the ethical issues that Margolles raises. And whether this playing with complicity is something which I'm worried about are being recruited into it through the systems of the art world and the collectors that might buy a human tongue, for example. Oh,
you can't buy any of her work, so she's a spirit of ethics. I think our ethics committee could not, fault. But I said I'm not good at being explicit, and my title is a bit me being a bit deliberately inexplicit, and it's obviously a reference to Freud's psychopathology of everyday life and the way in which within the Freudian analysis what we're trying to forget escapes, and in a sense what I see as Margolles' tactic is to force the appearance of what it is we're trying to repress into our consciousness. But in terms of when I first saw her work, I wasn't sure whether it was just exploitative. It's very it's anxiety making, and it was only after looking at it for a while, and particularly the pieces around the murders of the women in Ciudad Juarez, and now the Mexican Pavilion, I think are just really very, very powerful works that I don't know that many other people in the world are dealing with, as artists, are dealing with such difficult material, but actually coming up with something that isn't sensationalizing and that is actually forcing us to pay attention to something in a way that one would hope would actually change our attitudes to how we act politically. But I know that's always going to be a debate about whether that works or doesn't work. I mean, you have to think of this again, and maybe I wasn't being explicit, this is the Mexican Pavilion. So for this to actually be how a country is represented is quite a difficult issue. So I think for both Cuauhtémoc Medina and Teresa Margolles, this is a difficult choice to make, but it's obviously one that I think is quite an ethical and responsible choice to make. I suppose it was a reaction to the thematic of the Biennale as well, the sort of building new worlds kind of, so it's this idea of how artists are involved with the world, I suppose, was the thematic. So it asked for some...
I think, that was probably very timely. And, there is a sense of looking back, of trying to make some sense through an art practice, which is kind of encouraging, if still problematic in lots of ways. It was a very interesting presentation.
Thank you. I think I'm a stickler for punctuality. It's 6:59. 7 o'clock, you're promised drinks. So that gives you a good minute to race across with life pulsing through your veins to the banqueting room, to the Red Room. And we have, typical to cultural stereotypes, Mexican canapes.
Well, thank you very much, Oriana.